Okay, everyone, we're going to start the final session. So please take your seats, and I hope everyone online is ready. So this last session, we're going to have two presentations. And the first one is by Olivier Evrard on phytoremediation.
Thank you. So I will talk also on behalf of Nathalie, who is online. I will recontextualize the work we've been doing in Fukushima and show how this phytoremediation program could fit into this post-accidental research. So just, although Philippe introduced the lab yesterday, so he showed you that one of the ancestors of LSCE is the Center for Low Radioactivity. And so our activities are related to those initial activities where the idea is to measure radioactivity, both natural and artificial, to understand better the transfers in the environment. And we are mainly interested in those artificial radionuclides emitted by the nuclear bomb tests. Why? Because one of the reasons is because they coincide, their fallout coincides with the beginning of what we call the Great Acceleration Period, which corresponds to the massive increase of the world population, tropical forest loss, carbon dioxide emissions. And so for us, it gives us like a chronometer to understand better the processes that took place during this crucial period. So basically, most of the cesium, which is our favorite, let's say, marker, has been emitted during these global nuclear tests. And so in our team at LSCE, we use this along with other properties, including now we try to use environmental DNA, geochemistry, color, and other properties to understand better what's the impact of global change, including land use and global change on, but also climate change somehow, on sediment and contaminant transfers across the landscapes from land to the ocean. And so, of course, as we measure cesium and we are interested in soil erosion and riverine transfers of contaminants, when there was this accident in Fukushima in 2011, given it took place along the ocean, on mountainous landscapes, affected almost each year by typhoons, we expected the initial fallout pattern to move in response to heavy rainfall, but also in response to human activities conducted in these coastal catchments. And so the idea was to conduct research to understand how this initial fallout would flow across landscapes back to the oceans. So we are interested in cesium. We also looked together with other colleagues at other radionuclides, including short-lived radionuclides, but also long-lived radionuclides, including plutonium. Fortunately, only trace levels of plutonium were emitted by maximum, but still you can find a mark of these long-lived radionuclides in the environment. And the specificity of the nuclear accident in Fukushima is also the fact that the Japanese authorities were very active in terms of remediation, decontamination. So this is on the left, you see the map of the radioactive fallout pattern with, of course, an area with the highest fallout levels to the northwest of the power plant. But you see that it impacted a significant surface area in terrestrial Japan. And then to fit this fallout map, the Japanese authorities delineated areas where it was forbidden to live or forbidden to stay overnight, depending on the radioactive contamination level, with a focus on this red area, which was called the difficult to return zone, because the radiation dose rates exceeded strongly initially 20 millisieverts per year. So it was decided that people should not live there. The idea was not to keep this constant, but to remediate soils so that you could invite people to return to those areas. So they implemented different types of decontamination methods depending on the initial fallout level, starting with these light pink areas, less contaminated, and then moving to this dark pink area. And finally, although initially it was not supposed to be decontaminated, they targeted as well the difficult zone in red. So how did they decontaminate generally soils in this area? So they targeted residential areas and cropland. They did not target forests, and still forests, they cover like 75 to 80% of the surface area on the steepest slopes. So it's important to keep in mind. And in these residential areas, in these cropland areas, so what they did is that they removed the topsoil layer, concentrating cesium. Why? Because cesium binds strongly to the clays, to the silts. So it was definitely concentrated in the topsoil layer. So they removed that on thousands of square kilometers. So you can imagine that it generated a lot of waste, more than 20 million cubic meters of contaminated soil were removed. And then the idea was not to leave it like that and to replace the removed soil layer with fresh soil. So you see these yellow material. Basically, they open quarries and they crush the granite material that you find there, and they just put it to replace the soil they removed. So it cost a lot of money, and it generated a lot of disturbance in the landscape. No, it works. Also for agronomists, if you put like this granite originating sand on top of the cropland, this might have implications for cultivating the soils again. So we made several compilation of the information about decontamination because the situation evolved very rapidly on site. So when we updated these information last year, we found that it cost like 44 billion euros to decontaminate soils in this area, and generated, like you see, 10 to 20. There are also estimation of 30 million cubic meters of waste. And the result is that from the, let's say, 150,000 people who had to evacuate the zones in 2011, only about 30% returned. And sometimes different people returned to this area. So let's say that the overall balance is quite questionable. So what we did basically is to follow what happened like in the river system, draining the main radioactive plume on land. So we went back initially twice per year and then once per year along the river. So initially there were permanent monitoring stations, but because of a very strong typhoon in 2011, it flushed away all the stations to Pacific Ocean. But you found like very fresh, massive sediment deposits that we collected as a surrogate of the material that moved during the flood. And then we returned systematically to the same places, and we analyzed typically the radioactive cesium concentrations in this material from 2011 to 2022 on this graph. You see, of course, a lot of heterogeneity just because the plume in itself is heterogeneous. But also you see a change with time after 2015 that was characterized by the coincidence of a big typhoon and the widespread character of decontamination on land. We had a very strong decrease of the contamination levels. So basically you have about 90% decrease if you compare the situation in 2011 and 2022. So a strong decrease in the contamination levels, but still ongoing issues like about the situation occurring in forests that have not been targeted by remediation. There has been, with time, a transfer of the contamination from the canopy and the organic parts of the forest towards the mineral soil, which now concentrates almost all the cesium. And now the fear somehow is that with erosion occurring in these areas, there would be a perennial supply of this contaminated soil material towards the river systems. So there are lots of discussions about what could be done in forests, like debarking the trees and using that to produce shingles, which was done in ancestral times in Japan, but still not everyone agrees on that. A lot of discussions about the recultivation of croplands. You see that to prepare land for recultivation, they just plow it again. The residual, let's say, soil profile with the fresh soil they put on top of it. questions about the fertilization, including the potassium fertilization, because it's an analog of cesium to inhibit the transfer of the residual cesium towards the plants. But then there's also a problem of how people would consider eating food produced in Fukushima, despite you explained that it has been decontaminated. People are not always super enthusiastic to that idea. And so in this context, we had discussions with Nathalie and the BIAM about other ways to manage the land in this specific context. And so there were two projects, one on the environmental transfers funded by the Grand Emprunt Programme d'Investissement d'Avenir, which was Amorat for the environmental transfer parts, and then Demeterre about the solutions to remediate soils. On the other hand, so these projects came to an end, and then there was a second phase. And in this second phase, one of the ideas was to use plants, but not for like common phytoremediation. So phytoremediation would be that you plant vegetation that will extract the cesium contained in the soils, and with several cycles, you will finally decontaminate the soil. The problem is that you will come up with a lot of contaminated biomass, and then you need a lot of cycles to extract sufficiently cesium from the soil. So the other idea promoted by the colleagues, and Nathalie, you correct me if I'm wrong, was to, instead of that, to select vegetation that did not extract cesium so that it's not contaminated, and then you can use it safely for different types of applications. One of the ideas was, so the ideas, there were different plants that could be targeted, like flax, hemp, miscanthus, and the idea was to produce non-food materials, including bioplastic, or to produce bioenergy, so that you wouldn't need to decontaminate the soils and you would produce non-contaminated biomass. Basically, that was the idea, which was different from the common strategies after nuclear accidents or industrial accidents. So we discussed about finding funding agencies, including French and Japanese partners. And we also worked on, so the idea from the environmental science point of view was also to understand what would be the impact of these kind of practices on the environmental transfers by monitoring transfers upstream and downstream of these areas where you would plant this type of crops, and also trace the origin of material. So with together we had like a consortium with French and Japanese partners. Then there was a COVID situation, so it was a bit complicated to keep in touch on all this. But in the meantime, now that we are ready to restart the discussions, there are also new initiatives in Japan, like this new institute created by the Japanese government, Fukushima, for the research, education, and innovation in the region impacted by nuclear accidents. So we had identified like potential sites depending on the type of lithology and also the type of initial contamination levels, of course. Knowing that now there is a very interesting, on that point of view, place in this area where the local government decided not to decontaminate soils. So where you could still implement like novel strategies to manage land after such a situation. So just to say that this was conducted in a very different context, but we also try, so basically what we try to do is to understand how fast sediment and contaminants move across landscapes and in river systems, but we also try to understand where the material transiting the river comes from. And so we had different types of tools like geochemistry and so on, but now we try also to use DNA, environmental DNA metabar coding to have the information on the plants typically that leave an imprint on sediments. And this might go up to the species level so that we could target certain plants of interest in the material transiting like downstream of areas remediated with this type of strategy. What we try to do as well in lakes to collect sediment cores where sediment accumulates year after year to reconstruct what happened and analyze the content of the sediment which changed in time to reconstruct what happened in the landscape during these periods. So typically we have, let's say, a favorite spot, which is the Mano Dam. So it's to the north of the main plume, but still is draining a significantly affected zone in terms of radioactive contamination. With, as everywhere in the region, a lot of forest and the steep slopes and the cropland concentrated along river systems draining to the lake. And with the colleagues from the BIAM, so French Geological Survey, now we have a model because in this situation there were perennial monitoring, river monitoring stations from which we got data. And so we could calibrate like erosion models to understand how soil is getting eroded in this area, how it moves through river systems, and also to understand how cesium moves together with the soil and the sediments. And so we could show and validate with the data available that, of course, it's during the typhoons, you see their names here, that most of the transfer occur. We know that, but still it's good to quantify it. And then, of course, together with the soil and the sediment, you have most of the cesium getting transported during these heavy events. And so once the model was calibrated and validated, we could simulate scenarios like comparing whether what would have been happened if the Japanese authorities had decided not to decontaminate the land. And then you have a delta between both scenarios, but maybe this delta is not worth like 40 billion euros. So that was part of the strategy of understanding all the lessons we can learn from this type of situation and the choice they made. Potentially there were alternative choices, and with these models and along with the monitoring data, we can investigate that. So it's another way of seeing it, but you see that with and without decontamination, you have a delta, but still it doesn't completely change the situation on land. And still, you still have a significant quantity of radioactivity stored under forests. So now we try to continue this research, and then CNRS promoted since several years now international and interdisciplinary research in this type of regions, so in Fukushima. And so together with the Japanese colleague and a sociologist, urban specialist from CNRS, we got since 2020 what they call in the CNRS scheme an international research project. And now CNRS would like us to move from an international research project to an international research laboratory, which has different types of implications, but which increases the integration of and the settlement on site in Japan. And that's it. So Nathalie is online. So if Nathalie wants maybe to add something, if we still have time. Or...
So I think that's probably good for the time, but if you have any comments, Nathalie.
No, okay. It was okay. Thank you very much.